G'day, I'm Owen. You've joined the pub test, and in this one we are continuing the Jack the Ripper suspect series, and we have a bit of a story to tell. And this does get very complicated. But we are asking the question, could a former police officer have been Jack the Ripper? Well, let's put it to the pub test. Let me first tell you the story of a man who we only know as George Neating. Now we're moving forward in time to 1901, and he is now living in Cardiff. He's married, and his wife supports him. She's a seamstress, but she doesn't bring in enough money. And he makes sure that he lets her know how hopeless she is. He berates her. He beats her to the point where she has to run off to get help from other people. But we know this was a time when not much was done about these wife-beating, low-life degenerates. And this bloke has his own friends. He goes off drinking and gambling with the mere earnings that his wife is able to bring in. But sometimes he has a win. Then he doesn't mind, lashing that money out on a little bit of fun for himself. And so it goes. In May of 1901, he has a bit of a winning on the horse. So he gets on a train to perhaps go back and reminisce about some old times. And that train is headed to London. And on that journey back, he starts to reminisce about some events that happened around about 12 to 13 years previous, when he was only about 28 years old. He was a big, strapping country lad, and he fitted the police force in Whitechapel perfectly. Except there was a problem. He didn't like the fact that there were these gangs on the street and all they gave him to patrol with was a whistle and maybe a little baton. And he had to carry his own torch, his own lantern around. What's he going to do? How's he going to fight crime with these useless tools at his disposal when these gangs have knives? So what he would do if anything happened on his beat, he'd hightail it. He'd disappear into the cemetery and hide amongst the tombstones. And then he would come out once the other policemen were there. That way, and he knew from experience, he couldn't get into trouble. Yes, he was just walking his beat and came across the scene later. But things were difficult. There was not much to do when you're off duty and you're not from London. You've got no family. You have no relatives. So the only thing you could do was go into the pub and have a few drinks. Well, actually, it's cold in London too, so maybe a whiskey or two wouldn't hurt as you're walking around patrolling your beat. But the consumption of alcohol started to increase, and more frequently was he hiding amongst the tombstones. And before too long, the superiors started noticing a massive drop in his work performance. And he gets fired for drunkenness. Well, now he's embarrassed. But he's now also angry. So he will now make an embarrassment of that very police force that he used to work for. Now, how could he do that? He knew all the alleyways and laneways. He knew the police beats. So timing here would be crucial. So it was not hard to find these women, and he knew where they would take him. And he could commit these crimes right underneath the noses of the police walking the beat. So the crime in Bucks Row occurred. But then it had to ramp up for the next one in Hanbury Street. But this still was not getting the attention that it needed. So the plan was to run the police around, committing a crime at Dutfield's yard. But then the ultimate insult to the police in Mitre Square with Catherine Eddowes. Knowing that a policeman lived in Mitre Square and a former policeman worked in the warehouse and he performed that crime under those circumstances. Also knowing that a policeman was going to walk in at any time. But he knew how to get away. He even knew where to hide, where he would not be seen. But he still wanted more. This still wasn't enough. This sense of revenge and anger that had built up in him was not satiated yet. So then he struck gold when he met Mary Kelly. Except now there was a problem. On the way to her room, a man on the street got a good look at him. He still committed the crime in 13 Miller's Court, but this was going to be the crescendo. This was going to send the statement to the police. But then it was time for him to disappear. Start a new life. All these things are going through his mind on the train trip back. He found it funny that only a couple of years prior to 1901, a murder had occurred above the room where he committed the crime against Mary Kelly. That had brought the media back into it, saying, "Has Jack the Ripper returned?" Well, that was not a Jack the Ripper crime. But what he was about to do definitely was going to be. Now, whilst a lot of what I just said has to be pure speculation, there is a lot of fact based around this. Actually, in 1898, a woman by the name of Emily Roberts was killed above the room where Mary Kelly met her demise. And it did bring massive press at the time, saying this is a Ripper crime, mainly because of the location. Yes, and the person was brutally attacked, but it turned out it was another woman that had done away with her, and that crime was solved. But in 1901, in May of 1901, some very strange events happened in Dorset Street. Now, if you're new to the pub test or new to the Jack the Ripper saga, I would encourage you to go back and check out some of the other videos after watching this one, because then it'll make a lot more sense as to why this is sort of like a big deal. Because a woman in 1901 by the name of Annie Austin was brutally attacked in 37 Dorset Street. Yes, and Dorset Street is right where Miller's Court is. Now, apparently people heard this attack happen in her room. Well, it wasn't exactly her room, but she had a lodging room. And she took a bloke in for some money, and it said that people were a bit worried about what was going on in that room. But no one did anything. But in the morning, they went and checked on her and found that she was in a lot of trouble. She had been brutally assaulted with a knife. Now, she is taken to the hospital, and that is an important story as well, and she is still alive at this point. The police are called. They finally catch up with her at the hospital, and she gives the description of a short man. He had dark hair and mustache and had a Jewish appearance. But not long after that, she passes away. But now they're going around questioning the residents of 35 Dorset Street, saying, "Hey, what's going on?" And you know, they were getting the runaround, and the police knew it. So the police then felt it was most likely a local who committed this crime, and they were thinking it was maybe even one of the people from Dorset Street, the way everyone had just sort of closed ranks. And 35 Dorset Street was still known as Crossingham's Lodging House, which does get mentioned quite a lot in the Jack the Ripper saga for various reasons. In fact, Catherine Eddowes had been staying there. But the police really don't have much to go by. But then a bloke by the name of William Austin, yes, he heard of this attack and thought, I wonder if that could be my wife. So he makes his way to the police station. They take him and he identifies the body and says, yes, that's my wife, Annie. Now, he said they'd been married for about 8 years. And he was a 43-year-old labourer, but at this point he didn't have an actual residence. But he said only a few weeks prior to this, himself and Annie had been living at 37 Dorset Street, just next door. Now, they'd had 3 children together in this 8 years. Sadly, one had already deceased, but they had 2 daughters, aged 4 and 3. And that is a little side point I'm going to go down in very shortly. But he says he decides to split because of her total drunkenness. She can't control it, so he's going to take one of the children. So Elizabeth and Francis. Remembering these were 4 and 3 years old, so I would hope that those two were very close. Even at that young age, you can form that bond. But now William takes Elizabeth and leaves Francis with her drunken mother. Like, what did she do wrong? And sadly, and this seemed to happen a lot back then, but Francis is not mentioned in this at all after that. Mind you, neither is Elizabeth. Really don't know what happened to those poor girls. And that is also a tragedy in this particular story. But moving on, William pays 2 weeks' rent to Mrs. McCarthy so that Annie and Francis have a room to stay in for at least 2 weeks. And yes, that is the Mrs. McCarthy, as in wife of John McCarthy, who ran the lodging place at Miller's Court, and he had the McCarthy shop. They are still involved in this particular story, and yes, it will get very interesting, that particular part. But William Austen, moving on with his life, but then things took a very, very weird turn. Now remember, Annie said she did not really know the bloke who attacked her, and she described someone. William Austen was a big unit. He wasn't short, he was about 6 foot tall, which was huge back then. And yet a woman who was interviewed prior came out and said, well, I know who did it. It was the husband. It was William Austen. Yes, Mariah Moore just comes out of the blue and says it was him. And the police, they say, well, we don't have any other suspects, so let's bring him in. So they go and arrest William Austen, and he's now sitting in prison. But the police have got a real big problem, because they say that Annie Austen was found in room 44. And room is a big word to use. It wasn't a room, but it's almost a cubicle. But she had number 44. But the police didn't find any real evidence in room 44. They found evidence where this attack occurred in room 15. So they go to Daniel Sullivan, who was the manager there, and he said, look, mate, I just wasn't there at all. So I got no idea what's going on. But whilst William Austen is still in prison, various people are suggested as having perpetrated this crime. But the one that really stands out to me is a fairly, I would say, shady bloke. I think his name was Schulte. He says he wants to talk to a particular police officer. And this police officer, he's like, well, never heard of this bloke. Why does he want to talk to me? But apparently Schulte said that they'd had interactions before. So they make an appointment to meet. But Schulte doesn't turn up. So they make another appointment. He doesn't turn up to that one either. But P.C. Bowers, he decides, well, I got to find him because that's the policeman that Schulte wanted to talk to. So he hunts him down and gets a statement from Schulte that says the last person he saw Annie Austen with was McCarthy. Now, it doesn't say John McCarthy in the statements that I've seen, but I would suggest strongly that it most likely was John McCarthy who he said was seen with Annie Austen. Now, Annie Austen was only 28 years old. Mary Kelly was in her 20s, and it's said and has been insinuated that John McCarthy may have had more of an interest in Mary Kelly than just receiving the rent. Now, did Mrs. McCarthy know of this? Well, possibly. Was John McCarthy showing undue interest in Annie Austen? Well, interestingly, it was Mrs. McCarthy that had kicked Annie Austen out of 37 Dorset Street, the lodging house that they owned. And that's why she's now in 35 Dorset Street when this attack happened. Now, to me, that would raise some serious questions about John McCarthy. But they ignore this entire statement. In fact, a report's sent saying, we really can't trust this Schulte bloke. He's probably talking rubbish. The superiors look at it and they say, yep, seen, dismiss it. We're not interested in that anymore. I'm going to do a video later asking why about that particular story, and there is a lot to unpack about John McCarthy. Since I've done previous videos on what happened at Miller's Court, more information has come to light, and it may be very worthwhile just digging a bit back up. But let us return to this particular story. Now, despite the fact that people are now naming names, William Austen is still in prison. And it is Coroner Baxter. Yes, he was the coroner on a couple of the official Jack the Ripper victims, and he is the coroner for this one. Now, he knows William Austen is in prison. He also knows that there was a lot of dubious stuff happening at that 35 Dorset Street with all the people that were living there. And he gets Daniel Sullivan on the stand and gets him to admit that not only was he there on the day, he was the bloke that took Annie Austen to hospital, and yes, she was not in room 44, she was in room 15. And the evidence of where the attack occurred is seen in that room. Why did all the residents rally around and say it was room 44 and we don't know what's going on? That is bizarre. Yet, if you're staying at a Crossingham's lodging house back then, I would suggest that your trust for the police would be very low, because you're probably involved in activities that would get you into trouble. So it would be nothing to rally around each other, so to speak. And they didn't want the police snooping around for various reasons. So they only got the doctor in. And it was after Annie was at hospital that the police really got involved. Very strange, but no more questions are asked about that. But William Austen, as said, is still sitting in prison, and the only evidence they have against him is Maria Moore, who said it was him, and he had a little couple of blood spots on his shirt when they saw him. Well, they investigate the blood spots and find they have nothing to do with this whatsoever. And Coroner Baxter actually gets the police aside, has a little sidebar and says, look, I'm basically going to instruct the jury what I want them to say. Maybe get William Austen ready for release, because he didn't do it. So the jury returned the verdict of willful murder by person or persons unknown. William Austen is taken into the court, and basically the coroner says, mate, you are free to leave. And oddly, William Austen says nothing. He just turns and walks out. Not a word. I could probably understand why he would do that, because what are you going to say? Well, you're not going to say thank you, Your Honour. If you said anything, what you said might sort of get you back into prison, because you'd be rather angry. So perhaps the best thing to do is zip it, turn around and walk, which he did. And despite having various leads, the trail on who attacked Annie Austen goes cold. That is until August of 1901. When a letter is received at Scotland Yard sent by the Cardiff Police Force. And we're talking about George Neating. Yes, that's the bloke I was describing at the very start when I was telling that story. And he was a disgraceful human being, no doubt about it. Yes, he was a wife beater. He bludged off his wife. She was a seamstress. And the meager earnings that she made, well, he would take. He had his buddies. He'd go gambling. They knew it. And if he won very well on the horses or whatever else he was throwing his money away on, well, he wouldn't bring it home to help the family. He'd spend it on himself. Now, his buddies said that he had gone to London on that day in 1901. He had a big win. So he took a train down to no doubt have a good time. But he also claimed that he was part of the Whitechapel police force during 1888 when the Jack the Ripper crimes were going on. And yes, he used to hide, so he says, amongst the tombstones to make sure that he wouldn't get into trouble if anything happened whilst he was on duty. He matched the height. He matched the age. He was Jewish looking and dark hair and mustache. All the things that Annie Austen described. Well, they do take this information seriously. But the Whitechapel Police Force have no record of a George Needing. They said he doesn't exist. So they run some different names, trying to see, well, could it be just slightly misspelt? But they can't find anyone that would match that description. Now, oddly, the Cardiff police tried to get a photograph of this bloke to send back to Scotland Yard so they can look at it and someone might go, I remember that bloke, because this guy's behaviour would have stood out. But George Needing disappears. They never get a photo. And the trail goes cold. What was his real story, George Needing? What was his real name? Now, remembering people could change their names quite easily back then. So if he went back to Cardiff, he could have just picked up any name. No one would have asked it questions. But did they look back and go through the records of those who had been dismissed for drunkenness around 1888? I don't know. But those records, I'm assuming, are now long gone. And I certainly couldn't find anything myself. And from what I've seen, I don't think this bloke, George Needing, knew that this letter had been sent to Scotland Yard. Because I think he disappeared before then. Because of the address where they said he was living, he was no longer living at when the letter was sent. So he's come back from London, and I think he's taken off. It would not surprise me if he was the perpetrator of the crime against Annie Austen. But does it pass the pub test that George Needing was Jack the Ripper himself? Well, more information needs to be found out on this bloke, and, the trail has gone cold. But I think a further deep dive, if someone can find the information, is worthwhile on this guy. At least for the very fact to pin him for the crime against Annie Austen, which in my mind, he's the one that committed it. But what do you think? Do you think George Needing could have been Jack the Ripper? Well, let me know down in comments. As we see, these crimes really didn't seem to stop. The police were saying they're over. The papers kept throwing the name up now and then to sell a few copies. But as always, thank you very much for watching. It genuinely is appreciated. And thank you to all you legends who are sharing these videos. Give us a like, give us a subscribe. I'm Owen, you've been watching The Pub Test, and we will see you on the next one.